Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Ekulona, and this is Nashville. Christina Soontornvat is an engineer, STEM educator, and best-selling author. Her creative drive led her to begin writing books for kids of all ages, and that decision led to many successes. She's the author of 25 books and has a new one coming out soon. Her story is one of perseverance, drive, and curiosity, something she says is hereditary. So, what led her to where she is today? Well, in order to find out, allow me to welcome Christina Soontornvat to This Is Nashville. Christina, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Really appreciate you being here with us. Okay, so last spring, you released Made in Asian America, A History for Young People. And it's a nonfiction book adapted from the making of Asian America. And the book centers around Asian Americans in a way that's missing from a lot of history books that are out there. Tell me this, what are some of the topics that the book covers?
Oh my gosh. I mean, we cover hundreds of years of history of Asians in America before America is even a nation. So, I mean, we talk about immigration, migration, the impact of Asians and Asian Americans on civil rights. We cover just all of the incredible Asian Americans who have had an impact on our country's history, including, we begin and end the book with youth who are impacting our country right now. So we talk about young Asian Americans who are really pushing to have Asian American history covered in their school curriculums, included in their state curriculums. This is definitely something that has been missing from history curriculum for so long. When I was going to school, I didn't learn any Asian American history except for the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II. So there's just been this incredible push to know more about our history and our stories. And so, those stories of those young people pushing for that are a part of the book as well.
I understand what you're saying. Similarly, we learned only about the internment camps of the World War II era for Japanese Americans. And we learned a little bit about Chinese Americans helping establish and build the railroads that took the country from the east to the west, essentially. But that's it. Right. There are these large gaps. I feel I have an understanding what you're going to answer to this next question, but let me pose it to you. Why is it important to fill in these gaps of this history?
Well, I mean, if you want to know why America is so incredible and you want to understand the full picture of who we are as a nation and why are things happening right now? Why are politicians speaking the way they are right now? What are the big forces shaping our country in this moment? You have to understand all of our history, not just little pieces, little sound bites. So for me, especially, right now we're in the middle of an election and there is a ton. I mean, one of the number one conversations right now is immigration and having an understanding of how immigration has affected our economy and the way that political actors try to push their own agendas over history for so long, for over 100 years. These conversations coming up right now are ones that have been had about Asian immigrants before, the vilification of immigrants. It's all so familiar.
What do you make of America's relationship with history? America, as there's a lot of parts of our history that none of us are taught, let alone not just only about Asian Americans, but Hispanic Americans, African Americans, even white Americans. There's history here that we don't learn yet, particularly when it comes to election season and election time. History, honor, privilege, and patriotism are the words that are thrown in our face, these ideals for us to uphold and live up to, yet we don't even learn about them fully.
I think that there's a lot of people who are nervous that learning the truth is going to poke holes in the American story and make people feel less patriotic or less proud of being American. I feel like it's the opposite. I feel like the more that you learn, the more that you understand about our country, the more you love it and you want to keep improving it. I also feel like, there's this real fear of giving young people too much information. Like if we tell them the truth, if we tell them the full and complete history of all of the good things and the bad things that have happened in our nation's history, that it's going to somehow corrupt them or something like that. But working with young people, it's completely the opposite. They have this incredible capacity for nuance, for complexity, and they want to know the truth. They don't want anything to be withheld from them. So, I mean, they have been incredibly inspiring to work with and talk to.
Yes. Now, someone else who's inspiring to you, I understand, is your dad.
Oh,
and
yes.
He's a Thai immigrant, but he moved to Texas. How did he end up there?
Yes. So, okay, this is a great tie back to the book, because before I started working on this book and before I read Erica Lee's original book, I did not even understand my own family's history and how they fit into the fabric of American history. So my dad immigrated to the United States in 1968, and he was a part of a wave of immigration that happened after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. So this was part of the sweeping legislation in the 1960s, including like the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. And up until this point, it was really difficult for people from most Asian countries to immigrate to the United States. And after LBJ signed this act, he was able to immigrate. He came on a student visa with his brother, and they made their way to Texas because that was where they were going to go to school, work and go to school. And so, yeah, that's how he ended up there. His brother was going to SMU in Dallas.
And your dad was there with him just to hang out?
So my uncle was a wonderful student. He was here in the U.S. on a big scholarship. He went to law school. And my dad was a much less wonderful student, but a great businessman.
Okay.
And so he didn't excel as a scholar, but became an entrepreneur, started several businesses in the United States.
And it was in Texas where you met your mom, right?
That's right. So she was going to school there, and they met and fell in love. And their first business that they started was a small Asian grocery store. And they sort of just like took it over from the owners who wanted to sell it. And as part of having this Asian grocery store, they were traveling around the area, and my parents drove through a small town that's about an hour west of Dallas, and it's called Weatherford. And they noticed that there was not any kind of Asian restaurant like in the entire county in this area. And so just saw this incredible business opportunity, and we're like, hey, let's start a restaurant there. And
wow.
so they went out on a limb, took out a loan, and started Golden Moon Chinese Restaurant.
Now, were you around at that time?
I was 3 when they finally opened it. So I mean, like that was my second home, was this restaurant. I pretty much grew up there. And eventually we moved out to Weatherford. So we were living in Dallas. And then when I was in 3rd grade, we moved to Weatherford, and that became my home.
Was the restaurant successful from the beginning?
You know what? It really was. It's just so amazing to go back and think about how much we were embraced by that community. I think the people in the town really wanted us to succeed. They were, for the most part, welcomed us with open arms, and the restaurant is still open today.
Wow.
So this is 41 years later. So my parents have since sold it. They sold it to the staff there. So they don't own it anymore. But, it's so rare in the restaurant world to stay open for so long. It really means your community is behind you.
Yeah. And the food is good.
Yes, that's right. Of course. That's number one.
That's very important. What was it like growing up in Weatherford, rural Texas? How did that shape you? What was it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was everything. It's why I am the person I am today. So you can imagine we're the only Asian restaurant in the county. So there's not a lot of Asian people who live there. Our family was one of the only Asian American families in the town. And so when I started school, I was one of the only Asian American kids in my school. I think that for a lot of my friends, I was one of the first Asian people that they met.
Yeah.
And so that was a a big influence on my life. Just always knowing that there's something different about me, even though, for the most part, everyone was incredible. And I made the best friends of my life, had the best moments of my life. There was also racism in the town, some little things. I have heard them called microaggressions, just like small things that you hear. And then major things too, like, being singled out and called derogatory names. That was just a part of growing up there.
Unfortunately for a lot of people in America, that's a part of growing up. You talked about the little microaggressions and things that happen. Sometimes it's a sense of something you can feel. It's hard to put the exact instance on it. It's hard to identify the exact pinpointed time where, okay, this specifically was racist, but there's a feeling that develops there. You're this young kid, you're growing into an adolescent there in that town. Was there anyone who wasn't a family member who you could confide in and talk to when you went through those moments?
Oh, yes. So, so my best friend growing up, right when I first moved there, a little girl came up to me on the playground, and her name was Erica, and she just said, "Do you want to be my best friend?" Wow. It was like a commercial, and just this moment where I was like, yeah, I want to be your best friend. And we just became instant friends. And her father was an Iranian immigrant. So he immigrated from Iran, and she was also multiracial. And so in terms of confiding about racism, we actually never had any explicit conversation of, how does it make you feel when you experience these things? But we just got each other so much. we just had so much in common. And I really credit her with being able to thrive and survive, those years that can be difficult.
I wonder, did your mom experience any of that?
She did. She had people who would comment and say things. So this was, my parents got married in the 70s, and they, there was a time when they were at a restaurant, and the waiter at the restaurant refused to serve them because they were a mixed race couple. And actually that waiter got fired from their job and would rather get fired than serve food to my parents. So it was things like that. But her own parents, my grandparents, were incredibly welcoming of my dad. They just embraced him as their son right away. So growing up, I saw this wide spectrum of how people can be so loving, so inclusive, so welcoming. And then also, some people cannot be that way.
That's right. Now, one of your books is a memoir on your childhood called The Tryout.
Yes.
What made you want to write about that experience there?
Well, so the tryout really is about my whole experience growing up in Weatherford. So, it covers it goes through flashbacks of when I moved there and when I met my best friend and the things that we went through together. But the whole premise of the book is it's about trying out for cheerleader in middle school. So when I was in middle school, this was the early 90s. In my school, if you wanted to be cheerleader, you had to try out in front of the whole school, by yourself, like you and a partner, in the gym. Everyone would be sitting in the bleachers watching you. Wow. And then after the tryout, all the kids go back to their classrooms and vote on who makes the squad.
No pressure.
Yeah, right. It's a horror story, right? So, this was one of those things that we just kind of accepted as kids. And me and my friends would get together afterwards and talk about it and say can you believe that we did that? And then whenever I would tell this story, the look of horror and shock on people's faces, it just kind of gives you this impression of okay, this is an interesting story, right? This is high drama, the highest drama that a young person can go through. And so just thinking I got to write this stuff down.
And that was the book.
And
did you make the team?
I I can't tell you that.
Oh,
you gotta read
it.
the book.
Okay, I'll read.
Khalil.
Okay, I will. Now, your next book is a sequel. It's coming out this month. It's a sequel to The Tryout.
Yes. So it's called The Squad, and that's no spoiler.
Okay.
So the tryout takes place in 7th grade, and then the squad comes back in 8th grade. And you would think after that crazy experience of how you had to try out, if that my friends and I would never want to do that again, but we did. So in 8th grade, the girls are trying out for cheerleader again, and 8th grade, I had just this really great year. I was confident. I had amazing friends. School was going so well, and then kind of a bomb dropped where my parents told me that they were going to get a divorce.
Oh, wow.
So the book really goes into, what that means for me, especially as someone with a multiracial identity. You've grown up like with these two sides of you, and then all of a sudden they're splitting apart. And it's at this time in your life when like you're really forming your identity in your middle school years, and how you deal with all of that emotionally. But then also like all the hilarious and embarrassing things that happened to you in middle school. So
I do want to talk a little bit more about your parents after we take this short break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Christina Soontornvat and learn how she became the author and hear the story of how she published her first book. Stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil A. Colonna, and this is Nashville. My guest is author, engineer, and STEM educator Christina Soontornvat. She's written 25 books for kids of all ages, has a new one out this month. Before the awards and recognition for her skills as a literary force, she was a science educator. So how did she become the author we know today? Gladly, she is here to tell us about that. Christina, again, thank you for being with us.
It's been so great so far.
Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about your family. Your dad's brother, the person that he came to America with, you mentioned before, he went back to Thailand, and he became a very successful writer, a newspaper man, and an opinion columnist. Some people said that he was on the path to become the prime minister of the country. What happened?
Yes. So this is something that I really did not even know about my own uncle until he died. To me, he was always my Uncle Sammy, and just like so sweet, and his English was so great. So I loved talking to him. So he was just, my favorite uncle. And then when I was in high school, I remember this was after my parents had been divorced. So my dad came over to our house with this just devastated look on his face to tell us that my uncle had been assassinated. And he used that word. And I just didn't, I was like, maybe you don't know what that word means, because he was just, you mean he was killed? And then it all came to light how important he was in the country. He had started a media company. He was a very well-respected journalist, and he was standing up against corruption in the country. And so the people just loved him. He was a real champion of the people, and everyone was pushing him to run for prime minister. And people were saying like, "Oh, it's inevitable. He's going to be the next prime minister." And then he was shot by an opponent, not like a political opponent, but people who didn't like what he was standing up against.
Yeah.
And so I remember when my dad told me that, it was like later that day, he was like, "Look, turn on the news." And CNN was on, and it was a story on CNN. And I just, being a self-absorbed teenager, had no idea of this own role that he played in the country.
Was that something, how did that affect you?
So my dad immediately went to Thailand to take part in like the memorial services. And then I came a little bit later, and just regular people on the street would come up to us to tell us how sorry they were. It just, it was shocking and just so sad that he had such a bright future ahead of him, had all of this potential that was over. And then later, much later, like more recently that I've become a writer, when I go back to Thailand and people talk to me, they say, "Oh, you're just like your uncle," because he was a writer. And it just this connection that is very special and meaningful to me.
It fills you with a sense of purpose. Huh?
Yeah, definitely.
What was the most important lesson you learned from your parents?
Oh, my parents, so just being around the restaurant all the time, when you own a business like a restaurant, you are there 24/7. You are there early to open it. You're staying late. We were there on the weekends. I went there every day after school. I always was so proud of them that like they didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't, they decided to start this business. They had no experience running a business before. They had no like grand plan or advantages. They just kind of went ahead and said, okay, why not us? Like, let's just go for it. Let's do it. So they really showed me from an early age that no matter what, like, just jump in and you can figure it out along the way. They definitely showed me that.
So they don't suffer from paralysis through analysis.
Yeah, I guess
they're jumping in.
Yeah, and definitely my dad is more the one who jumps in, and my mom would be the one who like went to the library and checked out the books of like how to open a restaurant. Like nowadays you would YouTube that, but yeah, just like so much bravery and gumption and just a real entrepreneurial spirit that it took to do something like that. I mean, you just thinking about driving through this town when it was so tiny, far west Texas, and thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to open a Chinese food restaurant here. Like that takes a lot of vision and a lot of courage. So I think that has stayed with me. And when it came time to jump into being an author and trying to get published, I think that's something that influenced me and helped me.
I want to talk about that because being an author wasn't your plan. You were working on being an engineer. You were actually working for an engineering firm in Austin after college. At the same time, you started volunteering at a children's museum.
Yes.
Had this light bulb moment. What did you realize there?
Yeah, so just being an engineer was... I just thought that was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. That's what I studied in college. I always loved math and science, but I also always loved kids, being around kids, and especially like telling kids stories. So all through college, my job to make money on the side was babysitting. And that was like my back pocket, like trick as a babysitter to get the kids to fall in love with me and request me back to their well-paying parents, was tell them stories and make up stories with them. But I never thought about having that as a career. Like I had never met an author before. I didn't run in circles with anybody who wanted to write or do art for a living. Like it just would never have occurred to me that you could make a living as an artist or as a writer. And so, yes, when I was working as an engineer in Austin, I started volunteering at this children's museum, and it was just this like electric connection, just being back with kids, being in their world again. I just quit my engineering job and was like, I'm going to work in museums. And so I went back and got my graduate degree in science education and worked in science museums for 10 years, just designing exhibits and being around kids and their amazing energy, but always continuing to read and to write, to make up stories. Like, I mean, I go back and find journals of that time of just like my daily life. And then all of a sudden there will be an entry where I'm just making up a story and writing something down, just like a little scrap of something. But really didn't think about being a published author until I started writing what became my first book.
What made you put pen to paper on that first story?
So actually, I mean, this is a Tennessee story. My first book was a Tennessee story. So my husband's brother had 2 little girls. So these are my first nieces, and they had grown up in Sewanee, Tennessee. And there's just something about like the aunt-niece relationship. The aunt
Yeah.
the aunt relationship where you're this very special adult in their lives. And I just had this incredible connection with them and started making up a story for them that was, of course, had to be the most special story I had ever come up with, because these are my sweet, darling nieces. And the story just took on this life of its own. So even after I left them and went back to Texas, I kept thinking about this story, and I would write it down for them, like the next little piece of the story, and send it to them in the mail. And then they would write me back and be like, what happens next? So I'd write the next little piece. And it didn't even occur to me that I was like writing chapters for them, right? Like each segment of the story was like a chapter in a book. And it was almost complete when I started thinking, okay, what can I do with this? How do you even get a book published? But I never would have connected those dots, or probably would have taken me forever if I hadn't started meeting writers, working writers in Austin and hanging out with them. And these were people who were really serious about the business of getting published. Like, what does it mean to find an agent, to find an editor who's going to take your story to the next level? So it's just, so much of making a dream come true is knowing what is possible, figuring out all those little steps in between. So it was really the people in Austin who helped me do that.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekalona. We're talking this hour with Christina Soontornvat, the award-winning author. We're talking about her life, her mission, and why she's learned to never give up on dreams or goals. Okay, you talked about this. You were just telling a story to your nieces who you love so much, who view you as, look, all aunts automatically get a cool pass, I think. So you're cool, you're telling them this amazing story, you realize you have chapters, you begin to meet folks in the industry who can tie you in, teach you how to become published. But you said something there, felt to me like the whole inspiration for this was something that was of love of creating, and this organic love for your nieces, and a love you had for reading. It was your mom who gave you that love for reading initially, right?
Yes, she was the one who always took me to the library. We would go to bookstores, like every, like Christmas and birthdays, books were a part of those always. She would take me to go see plays, and just really fostered my love for literature. So I was always a really big reader, and always making things up on my own, like drawing and writing stories, but really never thinking, okay, I'm going to be the person who writes stories that other people read. I think that when you grow up in a small town and you're not exposed to that, and then, of course, back at that time in the 80s and 90s, literature for kids was not as diverse. There were authors who were doing it, but I just didn't have access to them in my libraries. So, there was nobody like me. I wasn't reading books by anyone like me who had a face like mine or a name like mine. So I just didn't even think about it until I got older.
I can imagine also being so focused on science and math with engineering and things. Not to say that, look, Immanuel Kant, I think, talks about science and art, right?
Yeah.
And some of his philosophical workings. But most of us think that, okay, if you're pursuing an engineering degree, there's no way you'd have time to be creative like this or what have you. But you are. I'm really interested in your creative process. Do you take a little bit of a scientific approach when you're writing your books?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that has definitely stuck with me from all my engineering training is that when you're an engineer, you're learning how to be a problem solver. That's what they're training you in college and in your internships and jobs. So you have to develop this mindset of, okay, they're going to put this really impossible seeming problem in front of me, and I have to take a deep breath and tell myself that I can do this. I can solve this. I just have to figure out all the pieces. So that is definitely the kind of mindset I have when I'm tackling like a really hard book or a really difficult passage. I can't figure out how to connect two ideas. Just take a deep breath and say, I can solve this. I can do it. I just got to figure out the right order.
Okay, so after the success of your first book, you had a setback a little bit with the second. How did you solve that problem?
Yeah, that was really such a difficult time. I think when you I mean, first of all, getting the first book published took years. From the moment that I had the idea for the story for my sweet little nieces to the moment it got published, it was 10 years. So they were like, almost teenagers by the time it got actually published. And so, but just having this feeling like, okay, now things are going right. I'm on the way. I'm on my path, right? So now it's just time to get the next book out there. Well, I wrote the second book. My second book was at the time called The Mapmaker's Boy, and I could not get anybody to take a look at it. They would read it and say like, there's just something missing. It's not, the writing's just not there. And actually my agent at the time, we parted ways because she didn't feel like she wanted to represent the book. And so it was a really hard time. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a one-hit wonder. I can't do this again. Yeah. I feel like it's something that's even a little bit more difficult when you have a little success and then you have a big setback, thinking like, oh, maybe that was a fluke. Maybe that's my only one. So that book, I really had to take a huge step back and figure out what my problem was. And the problem was that I was trying to write that book like someone else. The book was very British. It was it was sort of like I was trying to be a Roald Dahl or a Charles Dickens or something like that. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's not me. That's not authentic to me. So I had to do a complete rewrite, like strip it all down to the bones. And it became a very different book. And that book is now called The Last Mapmaker. And so, that whole process of taking a step back took 7 years. But eventually, it was definitely good that the first draft did not make it very far because it did go on to win a Newbery honor, the rewrite.
Is that like a part of the don't quit spirit that your parents gave you?
I think so, yeah. And just trusting yourself when you have this feeling of like, I just, there's something about it. I got to go back to it. Because I have definitely had books where they kind of didn't go anywhere and I've set them aside and they're probably not going to go anywhere. So it's just like learning to trust your gut a little bit. And yeah, what can I do? If it's going to happen, I'm going to have to be willing to just work really hard and bend over backwards to make it happen.
Some people are afraid to trust their gut. They don't know how to listen. I feel like it's a dance between like patience and perseverance.
Yeah, and it is really scary. I mean, like putting yourself out there, and when you work on something that long and you've made yourself vulnerable through your art and you're going to keep pushing and keep rejecting, keep getting rejected, that is pretty frightening.
Yeah.
So
it's tough. I mean, there's a lot of gatekeepers out there in the form of agents, representatives, and things, but you still have that faith and it doesn't interrupt the love of creating.
Yeah.
That happens to folks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the belief of like, why not me? Why not this? This does deserve a chance. I think there's so many people who get stopped by not believing that. Yeah. And that's definitely what my parents taught me. It's like, yeah, why not you? You can do it. If anybody else can do it, you can too.
And you have. We're going to take one more break. When we come back, we'll dive into some of the books penned by Christina Soontornvat. And we'll learn more about one that's meant to inspire a love for voting and democracy. We'll be right back. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Kulona, and this is Nashville. My guest is author Christina Soontornvat. Over the hour, we learned about her upbringing in Texas, how she went from working as an engineer to becoming an award-winning author. We also learned about the impact her parents have had on her life. She's a 3-time Newbery Honor recipient, most recently recognized for The Last Mapmaker, which was also named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times. Now let's talk with her about some of her other books. Christina, again, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Okay, I want to talk about the book, A Wish in the Dark. You're retelling Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. It's set in Thailand. What inspired you to write this book and to take this different look at this ages-old story?
Growing up, my dad would tell all sorts of stories about his childhood, especially in Bangkok, Thailand. And they were just like the myths, the legends of my childhood. He's such a great storyteller. And he had such a scrappy, kind of a hard childhood. His parents were very working class. They were working a lot. From a very young age, he had to have a job. He had to be very independent. So what went along with that was that he had a lot of freedom and just running around with his friends. And in Bangkok at that time, it's this city that's built on a river, and there's canals that go out from it. So people are using boats just as much as they are cars. And so he would tell stories of swimming in the river and hitching a ride on a speedboat as it pulled him all the way across the Chao Phraya River, which is like going across the Mississippi,
Wow.
It's like these crazy stories. So that was always just like in my head, this vivid imagery of what it would have been like to grow up then. And then Les Miserables, that was one of my very favorite books that I read as a young person, and one of my mom's favorite books. She actually brought it with her on a trip that we took to Thailand, because at that time, it was really hard to get English language books. So whenever we would go to Thailand as a family on a trip for like a month or something, she would try to bring the longest book she possibly could. And so Les Mis was like, 1,600 pages. So she was reading it while we were there. And I think I was 10 at the time. And she would tell me the story as she was reading it. So I was like hearing this incredible classic work of literature while I was in Thailand. I just think it must have impressed something in my brain, in my young brain, that came out later.
Did you begin to visualize the world you would then write down during those times?
I didn't then. I wrote A Wish in the Dark after, I talked about my struggles writing another book after my first one. And I think A Wish in the Dark was my way of just kind of shaking up my brain and being like, let's get completely creative and do something really, really different. Mm-hmm. So let's retell Victor Hugo's masterpiece and set it in a magical Thailand.
A magical Thailand.
Oh yeah.
I definitely agree.
It's a fantasy.
So it was released in March 2020. Pandemic is setting in. Not the best time to release a book, but it was a success despite the shutdown from the pandemic. How did that happen? What do you think help that happen during this really unprecedented and difficult time?
Oh my gosh. I remember when the book came out, you have all these visions of, you're going to have a party at a bookstore and you're going to go to libraries and meet readers. And then all of a sudden you're not going anywhere or doing anything. And it really felt like, nothing is going to happen with this book. And it was so embraced by librarians and by classroom teachers. I think it was also an escape for kids to read at that time. Books, they actually had a big surge during the pandemic because there was nothing else for us to do. And this story was very much an escape story, but it also dealt with a lot of issues of social justice, of inequality, things that we were also thinking about in a new way in 2020. So all of those things helped it to find its readers. But as always, I'm completely grateful to librarians who find these books and hand them to the kids that need them.
You also dipped into nonfiction a little bit with All 13. And it's the book about the rescue of the 12 young soccer players and their coach from a cave in northern Thailand. That all happened in 2018. It really captured the world's attention. Really fascinating story. You had never written a nonfiction book before. Why did you decide to take on this project of this amazing story of these young boys and their coach's rescue?
Yeah, it goes back to why not? Just do it, say you're going to do it, and then figure out how you're going to do it while you're doing it.
I love that, by the way.
Sometimes you just have to. Our family was actually in Thailand in 2018 when this was all happening. We were there on a family vacation, and I have some family that lives in northern Thailand, and that's where this took place in the mountains in the very far north. And right away, it was a big story. It was a local story, and then it was a national story. And it wouldn't be later until it was this international, global, sensational story, right? But so we were there watching it unfold, and it was everywhere on television, on the media. Everybody was talking about it. It was playing on every TV and every restaurant and hotel. And because I was in Thailand watching it, my family was translating for me because I don't speak Thai fluently. But the story was so much about these boys and about their families. Their families would get interviewed and their classmates would get interviewed. And then there were thousands of Thai people who came to the site to volunteer in any way they could. And then, of course, there was also an international response. There were Americans, there were British divers, there were other international divers who helped to get them out. It was this incredible story. But our family flew back to the U.S. just as the boys were getting rescued. And the rescue actually took place over 3 days. So we're watching it unfold over 3 days. And once the boys were all successfully rescued, which was just this impossible feat, no rescue of this type had ever been attempted before, cave diving rescue, then watching it reported on the American media and how that focus of who was involved shifted so much to the British divers, to the U.S. servicemen, to the Australian divers who helped. They became like the whole focus of the news story. And I just really felt like, but what, there's this other piece of it, like all of these incredible Thai people who did so much to help here, and the boys themselves. So it was kind of my big catalyst in trying to be like, okay, I have no idea how to write nonfiction. I've never done it before, but yeah, I got to be a part of telling the complete story for young people. So I knew right away it was going to be a story about young people for young readers.
So what'd you do?
So I just put together a proposal. I told my agent, let's do this. I had friends who had written nonfiction proposals and they sent them to me so I could try to copy it. I did end up getting a book deal. This is how much I did not know what I was doing. We have a family friend who's a journalist, and I called him and asked him, actually wrote down notes, how do you interview people? I had never done it before. I had to buy a tape recorder. And I mean, when I was, and then I always knew I was going to go back to Thailand to interview the people who were involved. And on the plane back to Thailand, I had one interview set up. I was supposed to be there for 10 days and had one guy that I was going to talk to. And I was having a breakdown on the plane of how are you going to write a book with one interview? And then but it turned out when I got there that the town where the boys lived and where all these rescuers lived is a small town, just like I grew up in a small town, and everybody knows each other. So after I talked to this one guy, he was like, my wife was involved in the rescue and her sister. And, the mayor is our friend. He's going to come and you can talk to him. So the whole 10 days, I ended up just speaking nonstop to people who had these incredible stories to share.
So you got the non-published stories.
That's right.
From folks in the town.
Yeah, I mean, I did talk to the divers and the people who were more interviewed by the mainstream, and but I did talk to people who some of them had never been interviewed by a journalist, who had, they were like the first people into the cave when the boys disappeared, and they hadn't been interviewed by anyone. That was really incredible.
Your dad was with you, right, when you did this?
Yes, he was my translator.
Ah.
He took his job really seriously. He was I tell him he should have a byline in the book because he worked on it so hard with me.
Now, you learned something surprising about the coach who was with the boys. What was that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't think I was going to get to interview the coach or the boys at all. It just so happened on the very last day of my trip that I got the chance to talk to them. And I mean, so Coach Eck, who guided the boys inside and was just really the reason they all survived, he was only 25. He was not like any 25-year-old I had ever talked to. He was just so wise, so calm, just, you could tell he's somebody who had been through a lot in his life. And so he had, for years, trained as a monk. He had been a monk for many years before he started coaching. He has this really sad family story. Most of his family had died. So he was really living as an orphan in these temples growing up as a monk. And the thing that kind of saved him was soccer. He just had this incredible passion for soccer and feeling like what you learn on the field, what you're doing on the field is so much more than just playing a game. This is like life is unfolding on the soccer field. And that's what he tried to impart in his players. And because he had that kind of a philosophy, that's really what helped keep them alive in the cave and stay together.
Wow.
Yeah, just absolutely. He's amazing.
Now, I want to move on to one of your more recent books, Leo's First Vote.
Yes.
It's about a little boy who's excited that his dad, who's recently become an American citizen, is going to vote for the first time. But then suddenly he hears one of his family members say something like, one person's vote doesn't matter.
That's right.
I'm not even going to vote. That's what they say in the book. But he instantly goes from being excited to discouraged. Was voting with you and your dad when he became an American citizen, is that what gave you the idea for this book?
Yes, definitely. So I remember, I think I was like 7 when my dad became a U.S. citizen, and just how excited and proud you are as a kid, that your parent is now a part of this country in this new way. And that was one of the things he was going to get to do, is vote for president. And every election, actually on the drive over here, he called me. He's in Thailand right now, and he called me, and we're talking about politics. So he's still really, really involved. And then I thought, this would be the perfect way to write a children's book, because the child and their parent are learning about all these new things together, which is so often true for children of immigrant parents. You're learning things to teach your parent. You're both kind of going through the learning process at the same time.
Sometimes it's not the most exciting thing to write about, particularly to capture kids' interest. How did you do that to make it accessible and engaging for kids?
Yeah, well, just thinking about from their point of view, what would be interesting, what would be fun. So the little boy, at the same time that his dad is preparing to vote in the real election, Leo is going to vote in his mock presidential election at school. So he's learning about all of these things, but just wondering, what does it matter? Is it going to matter if I actually fill out my little piece of paper in my classroom? And then when it actually comes down to it, he's the tiebreaker for his classroom vote. So it's all, that whole question of, does it matter if one person does something or not? I think that's something that kids feel kids can feel so helpless, and so the world is this big swirling thing, and what is their place in it? But we grown-ups feel that all the time. What am I doing that matters? What is my purpose? Every day that I get up, how am I going to be making a difference? Am I making a difference? So this book kind of just tackles that question in terms of voting, but also just in general. That each person matters, and everything that we do, every person that we touch every day, it makes a difference.
It's focused on voting and civic engagement, but it's more about purpose and how you can actively not only participate in your lives, but how that participation really impacts all of us in our communities, right?
Yeah. And I hope kids take that with them, all through their life. I think that's a big theme that's a part of every single book I write, whether it's a graphic novel or a picture book, is what you do matters. Even if it seems small, that effect reverberates out and makes a difference that really can be seen.
Question I want to ask you, do you have kids?
I do, yes. I have a 6th grader and a 9th grader.
6th grader and 9th grader.
I know, I'm in the thick of it.
You are totally in the thick of it. It's a bunch of groceries all the time, I imagine.
Yes.
Groceries and attitude. What do you want to convey to your kids? This idea that your parents and your family gave you, this, hey, we're going to figure out how to do it. We have an idea. We're going to make this happen. This drive that your parents gave you. How are you going to give that to your kids? But what's that new element that Christina's bringing into this family legacy?
Oh my gosh. I just really hope that they feel like they could do anything they want. I really truly believe that if you want something, if you work hard, if you just don't give up, you will be able to get it. I never would have thought as a kid that I would be writing books that kids are reading. And here I am. So I want them to know that. And I do want them to have a purpose. I want them to be doing something that they feel is making people's lives better, making the world a better place. So I think that's part of having a good life.
Christina, thank you so much for being here. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Christina Soontornvat is an award-winning author, engineer, and STEM educator. She was kind enough to take time to talk with us. All right, thanks to you for tuning in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced and directed by Mary Mancini. Our technical director and board operator is Liv Lombardi. The masterminds behind our theme music are Larange and Namir Blade. You can listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get good podcasts. And the conversation doesn't end here. Tweet us at This Is Nashville. Find us on Instagram and tell us what you want from our show by filling out our quick survey online. You can also call to leave us a message, 615-751-2500. We may or may not use that message on air. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Ekulona. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody, and be good to each other.